B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, December 12th, 2019. The Republican Circus is producing one clown after another to disrupt and divert the Impeachment-Lite proceedings being run by the Democratic majority in the House Judiciary Committee right today. So I watched a little bit this morning to see what the tone of the hearings were. I also watched last night, which was just a series of very predictable speeches. And what we're seeing is a kind of political ping pong. Democrats have their firmed up talking points. Republicans have theirs. And they just keep recycling them, bouncing them back and forth, and nobody's listening. And I'm afraid many Americans have tuned out and aren't really listening to the back and forth and trying to figure it all out for themselves. So here's an account from the New York Times about today's morning hearings. Amid Republican cries of outrage, Democrats were poised to approve, along party lines, a charge that Trump abused the powers of his office by pressuring Ukraine to announce investigations of his political rivals, seeking advantage for his re-election campaign, and using official acts as leverage. They were also on track to adopt a second charge against Trump for obstructing Congress based on his across-the-board defiance of their subpoenas, which Democrats branded an attempt to conceal the Ukraine scheme. A little bit later, they write, the vote expected tonight would cap 2 days of intense debate in the committee, a body known for attracting some of the House's most progressive and conservative members. But are any minds being changed? I don't think so. Steve Chabot, Republican from northeastern Ohio, reading from the Trump playbook. The entire argument for impeachment in this case is based on a charge that is not a crime, much less a high crime, and that has never been approved by the House of Representatives in a presidential impeachment before, ever in history. If that's the best you've got, you wasted a whole lot of time and taxpayer dollars because so many of you hate this president. Interesting new information from a pollster who sends me emails. This is from Ipsos, and they run national polls. They show that most Americans aren't really clear on what impeachment means. And as you probably know, because you listen to this podcast, you're so well informed, he said humbly, impeachment is the act of the House of Representatives to produce charges against the president, which are then heard in hearings, a trial, in the United States Senate. So here are statements about impeachment. What do you believe are true? First, a charge of misconduct made against an elected official. 79% of Democrats say that that's what impeachment means. Removal from office, well, 76% of Democrats, 73% of Republicans think impeachment means removal from office. And when you look at the current attitudes of Americans, 47% favor impeaching Trump and removing him, and 44% are against. But when you ask the question this way, well, it's actually a statement, and do you agree or not, President Trump has committed an impeachable offense. 57% of Americans, across party lines, agree with that statement, but only 47% want him removed. Now, in the hearings, we saw these clowns, like Matt Gaetz from Florida. And this is the kind of guy who yells and screams. He's very theatrical. He and Jim Jordan from Ohio and Collins from Georgia. They're the three ringleaders, the top clowns, in this particular circus. And Gaetz went a little too far today because in the morning hearing, he tried to rewrite the impeachment article number 1 to shift the focus from Joe Biden to Hunter Biden. And in his 5 minutes of unrestrained speech, Matt Gaetz said, based on a New Yorker article where Hunter Biden was reported to have been in a rental car crash, And the Hertz rental officer who wrote up the report told the reporter for the New Yorker that he found a crack pipe and white powder residue in the car. So Matt Gaetz picked up on that. He said, I don't want to make light of anybody's substance abuse issues, but it's a little hard to believe that Burisma hired Hunter Biden to resolve their international disputes when he could not resolve his own dispute with Hertz over leaving cocaine and a crack pipe in the car. Now, you may not know, and I didn't know this before, but Matt Gaetz has an unresolved DUI in Tampa. And so Hank Johnson, Democrat of Tennessee, said, I don't know what members, if any, have had any problems with substance abuse, been busted on DUI. I don't know. But if I did, I wouldn't raise it against anyone on this committee. I don't think it's proper. Snarky, but true. And according to the Washington Post, the drunk driving arrest was in 2008. Gaetz was never convicted, and there are still questions about special treatment that he may have received. Meanwhile, our dear tweeter, the stable genius over in the White House, fired off more than 80 tweets and retweets about impeachment just this morning. Now, we've been told that he's not really watching these impeachment hearings, but he was live tweeting to beat the band. And he also was keeping his party members in line by praising those who recited from the Trump talking points, and we'll get to a whole list of those here in a minute, and presumably intimidating those who might have some desire to stray from the official talking points. So at the end of a lengthy session this morning, the party line vote was 23-17 to defeat the Republican amendment to strike Article 1 of the impeachment articles. So I want to thank the Washington Post, and I've put up a link to their listicle. And I generally abhor listicles. BuzzFeed is the place where I see the most ridiculous. 10 ways that Ivanka Trump is a wonderful woman. I mean, they do that all day long. But here, the Post has listed the 27 defenses that Trump's allies have floated on Ukraine and impeachment. And I'm going to very quickly list them for you. And I think that they will resonate with you because you say, oh, yeah, I heard Rush Limbaugh saying that. Oh, yeah, I heard Jim Jordan spout that one. All right, number one, Trump's July 25th call with Ukraine's president was appropriate. There was no quid pro quo. Oh, we've heard that a lot, because Trump himself said in a phone call, no quid pro quo. Mac Thornberry of Texas advances the argument that the call was appropriate but not impeachable. Trump was only expressing his opinion on the July 25th call. Even if there was a quid pro quo, it wasn't a corrupt quid pro quo. Lindsey Graham has said, well, I don't think that this White House is capable. They're in such disarray of forming a quid pro quo. Rand Paul says if there was a quid pro quo, this happens all the time in foreign policy. Trump wasn't aware of the quid pro quo. Oh, I mean, that's just that's bullshit. Yes. What's next here? Oh, here's Lindsey. Yeah, Trump is incapable of a quid pro quo. His call for Ukraine and China to investigate the Bidens wasn't serious. It was some kind of a joke. But I watched him with the chopper noise in the background. He wasn't joking. Interpreting Trump's actions amount to differences of opinion. They also call that policy differences. That's such a stretch. The whistleblower complaint was based on hearsay. It was inaccurate. The whistleblower has a political bias. The whistleblower is part of the deep state. The Democrats should have produced the whistleblower, and they would be avoiding a lot of these questions. The impeachment inquiry is secret and an unfair process. Also, they claim that the due process rights that Trump should enjoy haven't been extended. These are all made up. These do not have any value or relevance. They are simply word salads. Jim Jordan said Ukraine said there was no pressure, but how many domestic violence victims say, oh, he didn't mean to hurt me? Well, I brought it on myself. Jordan, again, Ukraine didn't agree to any investigations. They didn't know the security aid was held up. Well, the date of their knowledge is somewhat in dispute, but they knew. There's no issue because Ukraine ultimately got the security aid. Then impeachment is a coup d'etat. Democrats have wanted to impeach Trump from the get-go. Gordon Sondland, who's being thrown under the bus, and I heard Rush Limbaugh help grease that on his radio show this morning. Sondland, they're saying, never directly heard Trump mention Ukrainian security aid. And, you know, it's clear that Sondland is considered expendable by the Republicans here. But he did offer damaging testimony of his direct conversations with Trump, and also his claims to others that he had been tasked by the president to work with Rudy Giuliani to achieve the back channel's goals. All right, Devin Nunes blames the media. Senator Kennedy from Louisiana says Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election. Doug Collins, the impeachment inquiry is moving too quickly. I actually think that's a legitimate objection. And number 27, Trump has not been accused of a crime. And to that, I have been burning your ears with my repeated calls for the Democrats to include an article of impeachment about the Michael Cohen plea deal for the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. And I am appalled that a woman who I respect and I've known as a member of Congress for many years, Zoe Lofgren of San Jose, California, said, I'd like to note that the argument of somehow lying about a sexual affair, referring to the Clinton impeachment, is an abuse of presidential power. But the misuse of presidential power to get a benefit somehow doesn't matter. If it's lying about sex, we could put Stormy Daniels' case ahead of us. We don't believe that's a high crime and misdemeanor. No, and it's not before us. And it should not be for us or be before us because it's not an abuse of presidential power. I so strongly disagree. Because not only did it potentially shape the election, violate campaign finance rules, use back-channel deals to pay people to obstruct justice, the president signed some of the checks to Michael Cohen to pay him off for the payoffs to the bimbos while he was in the Oval Office. And for the Democrats to reject that, and even in these arguments say that it has no place in this impeachment process, I find that deeply insulting. I've linked to an op-ed under the byline of Jeffrey Cabaservice or Cabaservice, don't know the man. But he writes, Republicans are turning impeachment into a carnival, and he says it could cost them. So he recites much of what I've told you about the way the Republicans don't have a legitimate basis to object to these articles of impeachment. And he digs up a great quote from Carl Sandburg. If the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. If the law and the facts are against you, pound the table and yell like hell. And that's what Jim Jordan and his cronies have been doing in these hearings. But the writer argues in the long term, the Republican approach will probably prove counterproductive. The party's critical weakness, as revealed by the 2018 midterms, is that it has lost the support of college-educated, mostly suburban voters, especially women, who once used to reliably vote Republican. By attempting to sabotage the impeachment process and refusing to address the substance of Trump's actions, the Republican Party will further damage its image with these voters and make it even harder to regain a governing majority. Well, I'd like to embrace this, but the cult of Republicans today, starting with the elected officials who will say anything, even things they flatly know aren't true, to advance the defense and the interest of Trump, they're not going to change. And the cult extends to many Republican voters who are part and parcel of this debacle. And they view the preservation of their president as more important than protection of the Constitution. And that is a sad commentary on America today. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins podcast with your subscriptions. Susan Vian just renewed an annual subscription. Thanks, Susan. The great people at DGL been on board for years now, chipping in $5 a month. Julie Dupree's a $10 contributor, and so's Joe Clarici. I am grateful to each of you. And it's my soft sell to invite other people to follow your lead and join the people who support this podcast. All you got to do is visit peterbcollins.com. There's a menu tab. You click on that, then click on Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page, and you can choose a level of support that's comfortable for you. As always, if you want to avoid PayPal, use the U.S. mail and direct it to Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Yesterday, I told you that Trump planned to sign an executive order which falsely categorizes Jewish Americans by nationality and race. And this is a sop to the Israel lobby. It supports the notion that BDS is anti-Semitic and that criticism of the State of Israel is anti-Semitic. And in a tepid editorial by the New York Times editorial board today, they, say they're kind of even-handed about it. They're not sufficiently outraged for me. They say while Trump's action might seem like a gesture of real concern, it does little to target the larger source of violent anti-Semitism in America, and it possibly threatens free speech rights. Possibly? Possibly? I'm sorry. It is a direct assault on my First Amendment rights and those of many Americans, including on college campuses. And the Times says, whatever its intent, BDS has helped to create a hostile environment for Jewish students, most of whom support Israel. Well, it is the effort to suppress speech by those who support Palestinians and other human rights advocates that have created this confrontation on campus. And I'm sorry to be this particular, but here in this editorial, the Times is once again depicting Jews as victims. And that is true some of the time. In the violent anti-Semitic acts that we've seen, many Jews have been direct victims. But when it comes to the claims of the damage of anti-Semitic speech, and speech that is called anti-Semitic by people who cannot stand criticism, we cross a line into very dangerous territory. A stronger reaction from the writer Kate Aronoff, who identifies herself as the granddaughter of Jews who emigrated to the United States. She says, anti-Semitism and anti-Communism, communism and anti-leftism more broadly share a violent and intimate history that stretches from Nazi Germany to the House Un-American Activities Committee to the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Charges of Judeo-Bolshevism have been a premise for limiting the scope of who deserves basic rights and citizenship. Like racism and sexism, anti-Semitism has oozed through history and as such is hardly limited to one side of the political spectrum. But despite their bad faith accusations of anti-Semitism against left-wing politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, and yes, it's election day in Britain and Jeremy Corbyn has had to weather a lot of false charges, smears of anti-Semitism, she continues, today's increasingly radical right is reviving this nasty trend more plainly than in decades and making life more dangerous for Jews from Pittsburgh to Germany. While they might carry a soft spot for Netanyahu, strong men in the model of Trump, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, will never be friends to the Jews. Attempts to close off countries to immigrants and anyone else not included in these politicians' tribal concepts of nationhood have historically worked out poorly for Jews. And speaking of Israel, the Knesset was unable to form a government, and they deadlocked, so last night the parliament dissolved itself and called for new elections in the coming months. This will be the third attempt to elect a new prime minister in less than a year, and it is going to be another race to the bottom with a lot of racist comments and racism hurled at the Israeli electorate. Part 4, which I think is the final installment of the Washington Post's Afghan Papers, is published today, and it focuses on the corruption in Afghanistan. And some of this is a little instructive about the Ukraine situation that is much more present in our minds now. And it is that the United States often talks a good game of opposing corruption, while it provides the stimulus to produce even more corruption. So in Ukraine, Trump says he's trying to root out corruption by trying to strike a corrupt bargain with the newbie president, Volodymyr Zelensky. In Afghanistan, we knew about the endemic corruption when we got there. And yet we brought in suitcases full of cash. We showered billions and billions in grift and graft on willing recipients, not all of whom were Afghan. Don't forget, there were Americans who cashed in there too. And the people who were interviewed for the Afghan Papers said the U.S. government failed to confront the distressing reality that it was responsible for fueling the corruption by doling out vast sums of money with limited foresight or regard for the consequences. And according to one State Department official, we were so desperate to have the alcoholics at the table, we kept pouring drinks, not knowing or considering we were killing them. Barnett Rubin, former senior State Department advisor, now at NYU. The basic assumption was that corruption is an Afghan problem and we are the solution. But there is one indispensable ingredient for corruption, money, and we were the ones who had the money. So I will assert that much of this is not new. We have richer detail. We have people who have been dragged onto the record against their will to describe the lies, the deception, the fraud, the waste, the debacle that is Afghanistan, the whatever war. Meanwhile, in Washington, Democrats and Republicans have joined forces. Despite the divisive impeachment and the claim that they can't get anything done, well, they're throwing more money at the Pentagon, and they threw out all of the clauses, the provisions in the National Defense Authorization Act that would have limited Trump's power to use the extra money they've given him to start a war with Iran, to continue U.S. involvement in Yemen. It's really disgusting. And when you look at what was eliminated, progressives worked very hard. For example, to ban the diversion of Pentagon funds to build the border wall. That was removed. Stronger language that would have forced the cleanup of the dangerous class of chemicals known as PFAS or PFAS was dropped. The final version jettisoned several other provisions, a ban on new prisoners at Guantanamo, prohibiting the sale of certain types of munitions to Saudi Arabia, and requiring Trump to seek congressional approval before taking any military action against Iran. Ilhan Omar, Democrat of the squad, quote, "This bill commits the U.S. to endless involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen, continues funding for endless war under the 2001 blank check, and does nothing to prevent the administration from launching a disastrous war with Iran." But the Democratic leaders, who consider themselves pragmatists, say, hey, we got 12 weeks of paid parental leave. That's Ivanka Trump's pet issue. We got a 3% pay raise for troops, an end to the Defense Department policy known as the widow's tax. But Jared Kushner, who was negotiating the final deal with Adam Smith, a Democratic congressman from Washington State, he insisted on funding or at least founding the Space Force, Trump's effort to militarize space, which I deeply oppose. And Kushner also intervened on behalf of his good buddy, brother Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, to delete measures that would have prohibited arms sales or military assistance to the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen. More grift and graft as the Pentagon investigator, the inspector general there, has opened a case involving an effort by Trump to directly steer construction contracts for his border wall to a North Dakota company that is not qualified. It has no history of any kind of government contracting. The connection is that it's owned by Tommy Fisher, who is a staunch MAGA man. He's repeatedly gone on Fox News to cheer for the border wall. And Trump has leaned on the Pentagon procurement people to select his company, Fisher Sand and Gravel, which does not meet the operational requirements of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and its prototype project came in late and over budget. No problem. He's a friend of Trump. That's how it works now, you know. And it's not a crime if the president does it. And speaking of the border wall, a second federal judge has issued an additional injunction blocking the redirection or the grabbing of $3.6 billion in military funds to build 175 miles of wall in California and 3 other states, this time from Judge Haywood Gilliam here in Oakland, California. While we have been distracted by impeachment, the IG's report, and all the other stuff that's going on, the Republicans in the Senate have confirmed another young, white, extreme, conservative, unqualified individual to a lifetime appointment, this time on the formerly liberal 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals here in San Francisco. The party line vote, 51-44, elevated a man named Lawrence Van Dyke. He is 47 years old. Another guy who was elevated is named Bumatai, and I don't know much about him, but he's 41. So these young extremists are going to be on the courts for decades. And this guy, Van Dyke, was the chief state litigator in both Montana and Nevada. The American Bar Association rated him as unqualified and described him as personally unfit. According to their report, he is intellectually qualified, but those who have worked with him say he is arrogant, lazy, an ideologue, lacks humility, has an entitlement temperament, and does not have an open mind. And Mitch McConnell has just nuked the traditions that permitted a senator from the state where a court appointee was being considered to approve or reject that nominee. But Mitch McConnell has found that inconvenient. And so we get these young, white, extremist, mostly male, appointees confirmed to the court. Appeals have been filed to challenge the conviction of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the younger brother of the 2 accused Boston Marathon bombers. And while I don't think that Tsarnaev is innocent, I do think that he was over-convicted. He's been sentenced to 6 death sentences, 20 life sentences, 4 more sentences of 7 to 25. And I do believe he was the patsy, and his older brother Tamerlan was the one who was calling the shots. Now, there are jury issues. There were 2 members of the jury who made public comments that showed they had already made up their minds about the younger Tsarnaev brothers' guilt. And I've just always felt they steered it into federal court because there's no death penalty in Massachusetts. I believe it was a state case. And it was heavily stage managed by the U.S. attorney and law enforcement in general to eliminate any questions, pesky questions, about the way they conducted that investigation. Want to recommend John Kiriaku's comments today, published at Consortium News. He's the former CIA officer who actually arrested Abu Zubaydah. The New York Times published some drawings by the Guantanamo prisoner for life, where he depicted, Zubaydah did, the different torture techniques that were used on him. And Kiriakou notes that when the New York Times published some of these drawings, the CIA demanded that they black out the stick figure sketches of the actual torturers. I mean, that just shows how ridiculous they can be. And there are good comments here from Kiriakou, too, criticizing the Times, which did publish the drawings, but provided very little context to Zubaydah and to the torture issues. If you haven't seen the new feature film, The Report, catch it over the holidays. Does a good job of exposing our dalliance with torture. Well, this one takes the cake. In reaction to the Inspector General report, Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch, the founders of Fusion GPS, and Glenn Simpson, it was noted in the IG report, refused to talk to those investigators. They're now in an op-ed in today's Guardian in Britain, advising British citizens to demand their own Mueller investigation. Sick, twisted. That's all I can say. Glenn Greenwald has resurfaced, and I'm glad to see this because Greenwald was one of the early critics of Russiagate, and he kind of dropped it and has been devoting a lot of attention to the issues in Brazil since Bolsonaro was elected. I highly recommend his piece today. It runs about 25 pages at The Intercept, where he is scathing in his criticism of the FBI, second only to his scathing criticism of the failures of the American media. I encourage you to check that out. Kevin Gostola at Shadowproof notes that the international organization called the Committee to Protect Journalists has published its annual list of journalists who are currently in jail. And notably excluded is one Julian Assange. And the Committee to Protect Journalists maintains that Assange is not a journalist, and that's why he is not on their list. This is a tragic co-option of a group that should be fighting for all journalists in jail all over the world, and they shouldn't forget Chelsea Manning, who is being fined $1,000 a day as she rots away in a federal jail in suburban Washington over bogus contempt of court charges. Chris Wallace, one of the only independent thinkers who works at Fox News, gave a talk last night at the Newseum. Now let's talk about the Newseum for a minute. I've been there. It's in Washington, and it purports to be a celebration of journalism. But, of course, it was funded by Al Newharth, the guy who made his fortune on USA Today, which is hardly a standard for journalism anywhere. And now the Newseum is selling its building. They're out of money, and they're going to move somewhere else and celebrate the history of journalism in America at a new location. But here's what Chris Wallace had to say about Donald Trump. He has done everything he can to undercut the media, to try to delegitimize us. I think his purpose is clear, to raise doubts when we report critically about him and his administration that we can be trusted. Back in 2017, he tweeted something that said far more about him than it did about us. The fake news media is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. He went on to say, let's be honest. Trump's attacks have done some damage. A Freedom Forum Institute poll associated with the Newseum found that 29% of Americans, almost a third, think the First Amendment goes too far. And 3/4 say that fake news is a serious threat to our democracy. And speaking of Fox News, Tucker Carlson and a guest named Seth Barron attacked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They showed pictures of trash on the streets of her district and claimed that that means she's not really an environmentalist. Using racist and xenophobic comments, Barron responded, her district is actually one of the least American districts in the country, and by that, I don't mean it's not part of America. It's occupied by relatively few American citizens. And the way they inhabit housing there is such that they live in a lot of illegal spaces like basements. Many people live there, so they wind up producing a lot of garbage that the landlords don't want thrown out normally. Hence, you wind up with a lot of garbage on the streets. You have So AOC said, I go back and forth on whether to go on Fox News. The main reason I haven't is squaring the fact that the ad revenue from it bankrolls a white supremacist sympathizer to broadcast an hour-long production of unmitigated racism without any accountability whatsoever. Well said, AOC. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast all the way to the very end here. Nice going. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins. How's that?
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.